Welcome back. A sea of blue descended on the union buildings in Tshwane earlier today as the DA launched its 2024 election manifesto. Joining us now to unpack the official opposition's 7 key priorities is political analyst McKinley. Mr. McKinley, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. As an analyst, what was your initial assessment of the manifesto launched by the official opposition party in South Africa?
Well, you know, it's different politics right now because this is the first time in this electoral season that the DA thinks they have a chance of actually governing. And I think their attitude, their approach is based upon that kind of assumption, which I don't necessarily share that assumption, but I think that what we have is a DA that is more confident than it has been in many past elections. And if you look at their 7 points, if you look at what they said at the launch today, if you look at the way in which they framed what it is that they are going to do if they were to govern South Africa, you can see that it hits all of the key points that I think they think that most people are believing that the ANC's failed fundamentally about. So if you take load shedding, for example, you take job creation, you take corruption, you take educational aspects, or in case of increasing poverty, and healthcare. These are crucial things that have always been on the agenda. So in that context, it's fairly easy for the DA to say, this is what we're going to do to make it better. And that's exactly what they did today in the context of saying, we're going to rescue South Africa. And I think it's interesting that they framed it in that sense. If you remember a few years ago, it was the Fight Back campaign, which didn't go down particularly well. And I don't think the DA has fundamentally yet understood that in South African politics and the history of South African politics, the words matter. And the sense of rescuing South Africa, while they can have legitimate critiques of what the ANC has failed to do, I think the notion of rescuing South Africa from a predominantly white party is problematic.
I mean, the DA has previously been criticized for placing their agenda on ANC's failures. Do you believe they've continued on that stance and not necessarily putting out what it is that they stand for, as opposed to constantly highlighting the failures of the ruling party?
Yeah, I think that they have not done enough to put so-called meat on the bone in this case. So let's take an example. What they say is, for example, that they're going to create 2 million jobs in their tenure. Now, how are they going to do that? If you look at the actual, the explanation of how they're going to do it, this is nothing new. The DA has been saying the same thing for the last 20 years, which is get the state fundamentally out of the economy, let the private sector come in, and basically stop, kowtowing to COSATU and for the unions, and basically relax the labor market. These are fundamentally nothing new. And one could then go into other examples in the DA's manifesto in relation to healthcare, in relation to other things. So while they might be correct in pointing out that the ANC has failed miserably on several fronts to actually improve people's lives on a range of different things, and we have a situation where, for example, with jobs, it's a crisis situation, their answers to that and what they're going to do with it don't really, I don't think, inspire a great deal of confidence to many people, because it's been the same agenda for quite some time.
And I mean, speaking of those 7 points, you do mention that they want to create 2 million jobs. They want to lift 6 million people out of poverty. But we know that cadre deployment has also been at the helm of the DA's fight against the ANC. And within their manifesto, they amplify the abolishing of cadre deployment in favor of a merit-based system. Is it likely to work in their favor?
Well, I think most people would probably agree in principle that that's a good thing, that we want to professionalize the public sector, that you want people that are there to do work and not to basically play around and do nothing and just draw salaries. And so there is a legitimate critique to be made, and the principle itself is correct. But the DA's own track record in governance in the context of the Western Cape, while they might be able to point to certain degrees of improvement in, let's say, certain service delivery to the middle class and otherwise, has not been without its own controversies and its own cadre issues and people who have been in positions who've been corrupt and otherwise. The DA will obviously say that they've acted against that, But I think it's a bit of an easy sort of target for them to talk about cater deployment when, in fact, most political parties will do exactly the same thing.
The DA also heightened quality health care for all, irrespective of economic status, as one of their key deliverables. The party has also previously stated 50 reasons why NHI will never work in the South African context. What strategy do you think that they will then use to ensure this promise?
Well, they call it a universal health care policy. I haven't really, got all the details of exactly, I don't think anybody has, of exactly how this is going to work. But my sense is that essentially what they want to do is they want to bring the private sector into the picture much more centrally. They want to obviously increase the levels of service at public hospitals, which is not a bad thing. I mean, we do have a crisis in public health care. There is a range of different things that can be changed. But I think where the DA falls short in this context is their fundamental belief. And this is why it's so difficult to sort of, imagine that if they do come into government, they're going to be able to address these fundamentals like healthcare in a meaningful way, which is that they see the private sector as the savior. Fundamentally, that's the driver of the economy, the driver of things are basically going to be the private sector. The state must play the sort of facilitative role. This is the classic neoliberal capitalist agenda, which has been tried across the world with varying degrees of success. But fundamentally, what it has achieved in most cases is there might be degrees of better efficiency or in certain things, but it's generally servicing people who have capital, those who are the middle class, those who are the upper class. And while the DA says they're going to help the poor and working class, which is the majority in this country, they have yet to show that they can really do that in the place that they govern, which is the Western Cape.
Last week, a week ago, this time the EFF placed their manifesto on the cards. The DA has done the same today. You mentioned earlier on that the DA seems overly confident with possibly governing. When you look at the two manifestos, the EFF's and the DA's, do you think that one would surpass over the other in being the official opposition party in the upcoming elections?
Look, I mean, if we were to believe our polls, or all the different polls, it's sort of a close race, so to speak, in terms of the official opposition. I think the DA will probably retain the second largest percentage of votes in all likelihood. I think the EFF will definitely gain. But if you look at the two manifestos, the EFF has a particular ideological positioning, which is basically trying to speak to youth in particular and younger people, saying, look, we want to be radical. But there's not much meat on that bone either. And this is the problem in the context. You can say, let's nationalize the mines, let's nationalize the banks, as the EFF manifesto says. But to do that, you have to have an incredibly capable state. You have to have professionalized state. You have to have people that are actually willing and able to run those kinds of enterprises. That is it's not basically thinking of that in the context of an EFF government is hard to imagine in at least 5 years. So I think what we have is we have classic cases of opposition parties making lots of promises, trying to capture the imagination of the electorate and saying, in the EFF's case, we're going to make radical, we haven't really transformed the country, which speaks to a particular constituency, while the DA is saying, the ANC's messed up, we're going to rescue. And so they speak to that constituency. And that's politics.
It certainly is. So overall, Dale, how realistic do you think the opposition parties' proposed plans and initiatives are, considering the current economic and political landscape in South Africa?
Look, I personally don't believe that the DA's manifesto is going to cut it. I think that they have a certain advantage in the context of the bad governance that has happened in this country for the last 10 or 15 years. People are angry. People are frustrated. People want some change. And they can take advantage of that to a certain extent. So they have that on their side. But in terms of the actual specifics of how they're going to go about that, it reminds me very much of many other governments across the world which have promised exactly the same kinds of things that have failed fundamentally. And why would I say that is because if you don't fundamentally prioritize the majority of people, yes, it's good to have principles. Yes, it's good to have efficiency, professionalization. All those things are good. But if you're not prioritizing the people most in need, then you're going to recreate the inequalities. You're going to recreate the divisions. And I think that's the fundamental challenge of the DA.
All right, Dale, thank you so much for your inputs this evening. That was political analyst Dale McKinley speaking to us there about the official opposition party's manifesto that was launched earlier today in Pretoria.